The ballroom was a masterpiece of understated opulence, a world sculpted from ivory, gold, and the soft, flattering glow of 1,000 tiny lights. Mark sat at a table near the back, a small, quiet island in a sea of celebratory noise. At 55, he was a man who had learned to be comfortable with the background. He wore a simple, well-tailored dark suit, a stark contrast to the glittering gowns and bespoke tuxedos that populated the room. He felt a familiar ache, a blend of pride and sorrow, as he watched his daughter, Lily, at the head table. At 25, she was breathtaking, a vision in white, her smile as bright and dazzling as the diamond necklace that graced her throat. She was laughing, her head tilted back, her hand resting easily on the arm of her new husband, Tom. Beside her, her mother, Elena, and her stepfather, David, presided over the scene like benevolent monarchs. David, with his silver hair, confident smile, and impeccably tailored suit, looked every bit the part of the proud father of the bride. He accepted congratulations with a magnanimous wave, his laughter booming across the room. Mark felt invisible. It was a feeling he had grown accustomed to over the years. He was a necessary footnote in his daughter's life, the biological fact that had been politely sidelined in favor of a more impressive, more affluent narrative. He had been invited, of course. It would have been unseemly not to. But his role was clear: to sit quietly, to smile politely, and to not disrupt the carefully constructed illusion of the perfect family. The meal was a blur of exquisite, tiny portions of food he couldn't name. The wine was excellent, but it tasted like ashes in his mouth. He watched as David and Elena moved from table to table, their progress marked by waves of laughter and applause. They were the hosts, the benefactors, the architects of this perfect day. Mark was just a guest. Finally, the clinking of a glass silenced the room. It was time for the toasts. David stood first, his presence commanding the attention of the room. He spoke with an easy, practiced charm, his voice full of warmth and humor. He told a few well-worn anecdotes about Lily's childhood, stories in which he was always the hero, the one who taught her to ride a bike, the one who comforted her after her first heartbreak, the one who worked tirelessly to give her the life she deserved. Mark listened, his hands clenched into fists under the table. He had been there for all those moments, but his role had been edited out of the official history. Then it was Lily's turn. She stood, her smile radiant, her eyes shining. She thanked her guests, her new husband, her mother. And then she turned her gaze to the head of the table, her voice thick with emotion. "But there is one person," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "One person who has been more than just a parent to me. He has been my rock, my guide, my inspiration, the man who showed me what it means to be strong, to be generous, to be loved." She paused, and in that brief, heart-stopping moment, a wild, irrational hope flared in Mark's chest. But then she looked directly at David. "I want to thank the man who has been my true father in every way that matters. My dad, David." The room erupted in applause. David, his eyes glistening with performative tears, stood and embraced her. Elena looked across the room, her eyes meeting Mark's for a fleeting second. In her gaze, he saw not malice, but a cool, dismissive triumph. The illusion was complete. The narrative was set in stone. Mark felt the air leave his lungs. It was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left him breathless. He had expected to be sidelined. He had not expected to be erased. He watched as his daughter, the little girl whose scraped knees he had bandaged, whose nightmares he had soothed, whose college tuition he had paid for with years of sleepless nights and double shifts, publicly disowned him. She had not just chosen another man. She had rewritten their entire history, and in her version, he did not exist. The applause died down. The chatter resumed. The world kept spinning. But for Mark, everything had stopped. He sat there for a long moment, the noise of the celebration fading into a dull roar. He felt 1,000 emotions at once: rage, grief, a profound, bottomless sorrow. He wanted to stand up and scream. He wanted to shatter the illusion, to tell everyone the truth. But then, a strange, cold calm settled over him. He had known this day would come, in one form or another. He had prepared for it. Slowly, deliberately, he stood up. A few people at the nearby tables glanced at him, their expressions curious. He ignored them. He walked toward the head table, his steps even and unhurried. He reached Lily, who looked up at him, her expression a mixture of surprise and slight embarrassment. He did not say a word. He simply leaned down and kissed her on the cheek. Her skin was warm, her perfume familiar. It was the same scent he had bought her for her 18th birthday. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and took out a single folded check. He held it out to her. "Congratulations, my dear," he said, his voice quiet but clear. Lily took the check, her brow furrowed in confusion. She started to unfold it, but he gently placed his hand over hers. "Later," he said softly. He straightened up and looked at David, who was watching him with a wary, condescending smile. Mark met his gaze and gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a nod of defeat. It was a nod of acknowledgement. The game was over. Then, without another word, Mark turned and walked away. He moved through the glittering ballroom, past the laughing guests and the tables laden with flowers, his back straight, his head held high. He did not look back. He walked out of the grand doors, out of the noise and the light, and into the cool, quiet darkness of the night. He had just been publicly executed, but he was not the one who had been defeated. The true reckoning was still to come. It was folded neatly in his daughter's hand. The city was a blur of smeared lights as Mark drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity. He didn't have a destination. He was just moving, putting distance between himself and the gilded ballroom where his heart had been so casually, so publicly vivisected. The quiet hum of his modest sedan was a stark contrast to the triumphant symphony of his daughter's betrayal. His mind, however, was not on the road. It was traveling back in time through the long, lonely corridors of the past. He was not, as David and Elena had so carefully curated him to be, a weekend dad, a distant, slightly pathetic figure who sent birthday cards a day late. He had been a husband, a father, a man with a dream. He remembered the early years with a painful clarity. He and Elena, young and full of a fierce, desperate love, living in a tiny, walk-up apartment that always smelled of paint fumes from his fledgling design studio. He had started his own graphic design business from scratch, working 18-hour days, fueled by cheap coffee and the unwavering belief that he could build a better life for his family. Lily had been born into that world of hopeful chaos, a tiny, perfect creature who had immediately become the center of his universe. He remembered the weight of her, a warm, sleeping bundle on his chest as he worked late into the night on a logo for a local bakery. He remembered the feel of her small hand in his as they walked to the park, her endless, curious questions about the world. He had not been a distant father. He had been her world, and she had been his. The cracks had started to appear when his business struggled. A major client went bankrupt, leaving him with a mountain of unpaid invoices. The long hours turned into longer hours. The stress began to fray the edges of their marriage. Elena, who had once shared his dreams, began to resent his struggles. And then David had entered the picture. David was everything Mark was not. He was older, established, a successful real estate developer with a confident smile and a wallet to match. He offered Elena a world of stability, of luxury, of ease. A world without late-night invoices and the constant, gnawing fear of failure. The divorce had been brutal, not because of legal battles, but because of the quiet, insidious way Elena had begun to poison Lily's mind. Mark was no longer the hard-working father. He was the failed businessman. He was no longer the loving dad. He was the man who was too busy to give them the life they deserved. The final, devastating blow had come a year after the divorce. David's own business had hit a rough patch. The life of luxury he had promised Elena was suddenly at risk, and Lily, who had been enrolled in a prestigious and eye-wateringly expensive private school, was about to be pulled out. Elena had come to him, her pride warring with her desperation. "Mark," she had said, sitting in his small, cluttered studio, looking utterly out of place. "We have a problem." He had listened, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest, as she explained their financial predicament. "I can't let Lily suffer," she had said, her voice breaking. "She loves that school. Her friends are there. It would crush her to have to leave." And then she had made the proposal, the devil's bargain that would define the rest of his life. "You can help," she had said, her eyes avoiding his. "You can pay for her tuition, and her riding lessons, and her summer camps. You can give her the life she's accustomed to." "And what do I get in return?" he had asked, his voice raw. "You get to know that she's happy," Elena had replied. "But there's a condition. She can never know the money comes from you. It has to come from David. It has to look like he is the one providing for her. It would confuse her, Mark. It would damage her relationship with him if she knew her successful stepfather couldn't afford her lifestyle." It was a monstrous, cruel proposition. He would be the silent, invisible benefactor, the ghost in their machine, funding the very illusion that was being used to erase him from his daughter's life. He should have said no. He should have fought for his own dignity. But then he thought of Lily. He thought of her bright, happy face, of her love for her school, of her dreams. And he knew, with a sickening certainty, that he would do anything to protect that happiness, even if it meant sacrificing his own. "I'll do it," he had said, the words tasting like poison. And so the secret agreement was born. For the next 15 years, Mark had been the silent engine of his daughter's privileged life. He had worked relentlessly, taken on extra projects, selling his own small personal assets, living a life of quiet frugality. Every month, a significant portion of his income was transferred to a separate account, an account from which Elena and David would draw to pay for Lily's life. He had watched from a distance as David took the credit for his sacrifices. He had listened to Lily talk excitedly about the surprise trip to Europe David had given her for her 16th birthday, a trip Mark had paid for with the proceeds from selling his own small beloved sailboat. He had smiled through her stories of the expensive summer camps, the designer clothes, the top-tier university, all funded by his own sweat and sacrifice. He had become a ghost in his own family's history, a silent, unseen provider whose love was laundered through another man's bank account. He had done it all for her, for the love of a daughter who, tonight, had stood up in front of a room full of people and declared that another man was her true father. He pulled his car over to the side of a dark, deserted street, and finally, in the privacy of his own small, quiet world, he let the tears come. They were not tears of self-pity. They were tears of a profound, bottomless grief for the father he had been and the daughter he had lost. In the lavish, presidential suite of the hotel where the wedding reception was held, the atmosphere was not one of celebration, but of tense, simmering conflict. Elena paced the floor, her expensive silk gown rustling with each agitated step. David sat in a plush armchair, his tie loosened, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He was staring out at the glittering city lights, but he wasn't seeing them. They did not see themselves as villains. In the carefully constructed narrative of their lives, they were the heroes, the saviors who had rescued Lily from a life of mediocrity. They were the architects of her happiness, and Mark was merely a necessary, if inconvenient, subcontractor. "I can't believe he did that," Elena said, her voice a low, furious hiss. "To walk out like that, to make a scene." "He didn't make a scene, my dear," David said, his voice weary. "That was the problem. He was quiet, dignified. It made us look like the villains." He took a long swallow of his drink. The lie had begun so long ago that it had started to feel like the truth. When he had first met Elena, he had been at the peak of his career, a man who believed his own hype. He had seen Mark as a failure, a small-time dreamer who couldn't provide for his beautiful wife and child. He had swept in the charismatic rescuer, promising a life of security and ease. But the world of real estate was fickle. The market had turned, and he had found himself overextended, his cash flow a trickle. The shame of it had been unbearable. He, David, the master of the universe, couldn't afford his stepdaughter's private school tuition. The secret agreement with Mark had been a lifeline, but it had also been a poison. It had saved his pride, but it had cost him his integrity. To maintain the illusion of his own success, he had been forced to accept the charity of the very man he despised. And so, the lie had grown, layer by layer. It was not a conscious, malicious campaign at first. It was a series of small, self-serving justifications. "It's better for Lily this way," Elena would say, after a large sum of money had been transferred from Mark's account. "She needs to see David as a strong, capable father figure." They had convinced themselves that they were protecting Lily from the trauma of knowing her biological father was struggling. They framed his frugality as a lack of generosity, his long work hours as a lack of interest. They subtly, skillfully painted a portrait of Mark as a distant, slightly pathetic figure, a man to be pitied but not respected. When Lily would come home from a weekend with her father, her pockets empty of the expensive toys her friends had, Elena would sigh sympathetically. "Your father does his best, darling. But his business, it's not always easy for him." Then, a few days later, David would surprise Lily with the very toy she had wanted, a grand, magnanimous gesture funded by Mark's quiet, relentless work. Lily, a child who saw only the result, not the source, learned to associate her father with disappointment and her stepfather with generosity. Over the years, the lie had become their reality. They had come to believe their own press. They saw Mark's monthly payments not as a sacrifice, but as an obligation, a kind of alimony for their emotional labor of raising his child. The wedding had been the culmination of this long, elaborate deception. When Lily had announced her engagement, she had, of course, come to David for the money. "I want it to be perfect, Dad," she had said, her eyes shining. David, whose finances were once again in a precarious state after a series of bad investments, had felt a familiar, cold panic. He couldn't afford a wedding of the scale Lily was dreaming of, but more importantly, he couldn't bear the thought of admitting it. So he had made the call, the final, humiliating call to Mark. "It's for Lily," he had said, his voice a mixture of arrogance and desperation. "She deserves the best. It's the last thing you'll ever have to do for her." Mark, after a long, heavy silence, had agreed. He had transferred the entire amount, a sum that represented years of his own savings, into a designated account. He had made only one condition. "I want to be there, David," he had said, his voice quiet but firm. "I want to see my daughter get married." David had agreed, never imagining that Mark's presence would be anything more than a silent, defeated acknowledgement of his own irrelevance. Now, sitting in the hotel suite, the echoes of the applause for his generosity still ringing in his ears, David felt a profound sense of unease. The check. Why had Mark given her a check? And why had he been so calm? "He's planning something," David said, more to himself than to Elena. That wasn't the act of a defeated man. "What can he do?" Elena scoffed, her fear manifesting as anger. "He's nobody. He has nothing." But David wasn't so sure. He had spent 15 years underestimating Mark, building his own life on the foundation of another man's sacrifice. He'd always assumed that Mark's silence was a sign of weakness. But as he replayed the scene in his mind, the quiet walk, the gentle kiss, the calm, steady gaze, he began to wonder, what if it wasn't weakness? What if it was strength? What if the ghost they had tried so hard to erase had just found a way to haunt them after all? The thought sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the expensive, empty room. Back in the ballroom, the party had resumed its glittering, chaotic rhythm, but a subtle undercurrent of unease had settled over the head table. Mark's quiet, abrupt departure had left a vacuum, a question mark hanging in the air. Lily, still flushed from the toasts and the applause, sat with the folded check in her hand, a small, white rectangle that felt strangely heavy. What was that all about? Tom, her new husband, asked, leaning in close. He was a kind, straightforward man who had always found the dynamic between Lily's father and stepfather slightly confusing. "I don't know," Lily murmured, her brow furrowed. "He's just being Dad, a little dramatic." She tried to laugh it off, but the gesture felt hollow. Elena and David had not yet returned from their fresh air break, which only added to the growing sense of awkwardness. "Well," Tom said, gesturing to the check in her hand, "aren't you going to open it? Maybe it's a sentimental note." Lily looked at the check. She expected a modest sum, a token gesture, $100, maybe $2. something her father could afford. It was the thought that counted, she told herself, a phrase she had learned to use whenever she spoke of her father's gifts. With a sense of dutiful curiosity, she unfolded the paper. And the world stopped. For a moment, she didn't understand what she was looking at. Numbers were a blur, a string of zeros that didn't seem to make sense. She blinked, her mind struggling to process the information. She read the amount again, her lips moving silently. $150,000. Her breath caught in her throat. It was an impossible number. It was the exact, to the penny, final cost of the entire wedding. The venue, the catering, the flowers, the band, the dress, everything. Her first thought was that it was a joke, a bizarre, cruel prank. But then her eyes drifted to the top left corner of the check, to the space where the payer's information was printed. She had expected to see David's name, or perhaps the name of his real estate company. But it wasn't there. Instead, in simple block letters, were the words, Markham Designs, Inker 142B, West Industrial Way. And below that, in the signature line, was a familiar, slightly slanted script she had not seen on a check since she was a little girl. Markham, her father's signature. The check trembled in her hand. She looked up, her eyes wide with a confusion so profound it felt like a physical blow. She looked at Tom, who was watching her with a concerned expression. "Lily, what is it? Are you okay?" She couldn't speak. She simply held out the check. Tom took it, his eyes scanning the paper. His jaw went slack. I don't understand," he said, his voice a low whisper. "I thought David paid for everything." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and irrefutable. The lie, the beautiful, carefully constructed lie that had been the foundation of her entire life, was beginning to crumble. At that moment, Elena and David returned to the table, their faces flushed, their smiles brittle. "Everything all right, darling?" Elena asked, her voice a little too bright. Lily didn't answer. She just looked at her mother, then at her stepfather, and then back at the check in her hand. She held it up, the paper shaking violently now. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. David glanced at the check, and the color drained from his face. He looked as if he had seen a ghost. Elena followed his gaze, and her practiced society smile froze, then shattered. "Lily, darling, it's complicated," Elena began, reaching for her hand. Lily snatched her hand away. "Complicated," she repeated, her voice rising, drawing the attention of the nearby guests. "You told me David paid for this wedding. You stood up there and let him take the credit for it. But this is from Dad, from my dad." The word "dad" came out with a force that surprised even her. It was a word she had used for David for years, a title she had bestowed upon him. But now, seeing her biological father's name on this check, the word felt different. It felt real. "Now, Lily, let's not make a scene," David said, his voice a low, urgent hiss. "We can discuss this later." "No," Lily said, her voice gaining strength. "We're going to discuss it now. What is this? And what else have you been lying to me about?" The guests at the surrounding tables had fallen silent. Their forks paused halfway to their mouths. The band, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, faltered and stopped playing. The entire glittering ballroom, which had been a symphony of celebration just moments before, was now a silent, gaping stage. And in the center of it all was Lily, holding a single piece of paper that had just detonated her entire world. The check was no longer just a gift. It was a revelation. It was a key that had just unlocked a door she had never even known was there. And she knew, with a sickening, terrifying certainty, that on the other side of that door lay a truth that would change everything. The silence in the ballroom was a fragile, crystalline thing, and Lily shattered it. "I want to know what this is," she repeated, her voice no longer a whisper, but a clear, sharp demand that cut through the hushed atmosphere. She stood up, the white silk of her wedding gown pooling around her feet, the check held out in front of her like a weapon. Now. David, his face a mask of pale, waxy composure, also stood. "Lily, this is neither the time nor the place," he said, his voice a low, commanding rumble meant to quell the rising tide of scandal. But Lily was beyond being managed. The carefully constructed world she had inhabited had just been revealed as a stage set, and she was determined to see what lay behind the painted canvas. "No," she said, her gaze sweeping from David to her mother. "This is the perfect time, and the perfect place. You stood up here in front of all these people, our family, our friends, and you lied. You let everyone believe that you paid for this day." She turned to Tom, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "He didn't pay for it, Tom. My father did." Elena, seeing the situation spiraling out of control, grabbed Lily's arm. "Darling, please," she hissed, her fingers digging into Lily's skin. "You're making a scene. You're embarrassing us." "Embarrassing you?" Lily pulled her arm away, her voice rising with a hysterical edge. "You've been lying to me my entire life, and you're worried about being embarrassed?" She turned and walked, almost ran, from the head table, heading for a small private anteroom off the main ballroom. Tom, after a moment's hesitation, followed her. David and Elena, their faces grim, had no choice but to do the same, leaving behind a room full of stunned, whispering guests. Inside the small, velvet-draped room, the confrontation exploded. "Tell me the truth," Lily demanded, her back against the closed door, her chest heaving. "All of it." David, cornered and stripped of his public persona, dropped the facade of the benevolent patriarch. His face was hard, his eyes cold. "The truth?" he said with a sneer. "The truth is that your father is a manipulative, pathetic man who is trying to ruin your wedding day." "He didn't ruin it," Tom interjected, stepping forward to stand beside his wife. "He paid for it. The question is, why did you pretend that you did?" "It was to protect her," Elena cried, her voice shrill. "We were protecting you, Lily, from the truth, from knowing that your father was a failure who couldn't give you the life you deserved." "The life I deserved?" Lily repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "What life? The life that he was paying for all along?" The question hung in the air, a stunning, unbelievable accusation. David laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Don't be ridiculous. He paid for the wedding, yes. It was the least he could do. A final gesture, but the rest, your school, your clothes, your life, that was me." "Was it?" Lily's voice was soft, but it held a new, sharp edge of suspicion. The check had been a key, and it had unlocked a room full of questions. She began to remember things, small, disconnected moments that suddenly clicked into place with a horrifying clarity. She remembered being 10 years old, crying because she couldn't go to the expensive summer riding camp with her friends. Her father, Mark, had looked at her with such sadness, telling her he just couldn't afford it. A week later, David had surprised her, announcing that a business deal had come through, and she could go to the camp after all. She remembered her 16th birthday, begging for a trip to Paris. Mark had offered to take her camping in the national park. She had thrown a tantrum, calling him cheap. 2 weeks later, David had presented her with 2 plane tickets to France, a reward for her good grades. She remembered applying to college, the crushing weight of the tuition fees. Mark had sat with her for hours, helping her fill out financial aid forms, looking for scholarships. Then, miraculously, David had announced that a long-lost investment had paid off, and he would be able to cover her entire 4 years. One by one, the pieces fell into place, forming a mosaic of deceit so vast, so complete, that it took her breath away. "It was all him, wasn't it?" she whispered, her gaze fixed on her mother. "All of it. The school, the camps, the trips, the university. It was all Dad." Elena's face crumpled. She couldn't meet her daughter's eyes. In her silence, Lily found her answer. "You let me treat him like he was nothing," Lily said, her voice breaking with the force of her realization. "You let me believe he was a failure, a distant, uncaring father who couldn't be bothered. You let me mock his simple gifts. You let me stand up there tonight and publicly humiliate him, publicly erase him from my life." She turned to David, her eyes blazing with a fury he had never seen. "And you took the credit. You played the part of the generous, successful father, all while living off the sacrifices of the man you taught me to despise." "It was for your own good," David stammered, his usual confidence gone. "We wanted you to have the best." "You wanted to have the best," Lily corrected, her voice dripping with contempt. "You wanted the lifestyle, the reputation, the adoration, and you used me and you used him to get it. You didn't just lie to me. You stole my father from me. You stole years of my life, years I could have spent knowing him, respecting him, loving him for who he truly was." She looked at the 2 of them, at the architects of her gilded cage, and she felt nothing but a profound, hollow emptiness. The beautiful, perfect world they had built for her was a sham, and the love she had felt for them was now tainted with the bitter taste of deceit. "Get out," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Lily, please," Elena sobbed. "Get out," she repeated, her voice rising. "Both of you, get out of my sight." She turned her back on him, leaning against the wall for support, her body shaking uncontrollably. She heard the door open and close. She was alone with Tom, in a small, velvet-lined room, on her wedding day, her life in ruins. The party was over. The truth had arrived, and it was more devastating than she could have ever imagined. Mark drove with no destination in mind, the city streets a meaningless grid. The adrenaline that had carried him through the ballroom had faded, leaving behind a vast, hollow emptiness. He felt like a man who had just walked away from a controlled demolition, the dust still settling, the full extent of the damage not yet clear. He had done what he had to do. He had told the truth in his own quiet, devastating way, but there was no triumph in it, only a profound, aching sorrow. He ended up at his own apartment, a small, modest space that felt both like a refuge and a prison. It was a world away from the glittering opulence of the wedding. Here, the furniture was old but comfortable. The walls were lined with books, and the only art was a collection of Lily's childhood drawings, framed and hung with a father's unabashed pride. He walked over to the mantelpiece and picked up his favorite photograph. It was of a 5-year-old Lily perched on his shoulders at a county fair. She was holding a half-eaten candy apple, her face sticky and beaming, her small hand tangled in his hair. He remembered that day with a painful clarity. He had been exhausted, working 2 jobs to make ends meet, but he had spent his last $20 on ride tickets and junk food just to see her smile like that. He sank into his worn armchair, the photograph held tightly in his hands. He had not destroyed his daughter's wedding. He had simply held up a mirror. The ugliness she had seen in it was not of his making. He didn't know how much time had passed when the phone rang. The sound was jarring in the quiet apartment. He stared at it, his heart beginning to pound. He knew who it was. He let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. He wasn't ready. He didn't know what he would say. But on the 4th ring, he picked it up, his hand trembling slightly. "Hello? Dad?" It was Lily. Her voice was small, broken, a sound he had not heard since she was a little girl who had fallen off her bike. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated pain. "It's me," she whispered, and then she began to sob, raw, ragged sounds that tore through the phone line and straight into his heart. He didn't speak. He just listened, his own eyes filling with tears. He listened to the sound of his daughter's world breaking apart. He listened to the sound of 15 years of lies dissolving in a torrent of grief. "Dad, I'm so sorry," she finally managed to say, her voice choked with tears. "I'm so sorry." "I know, sweetheart," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. "I know." There was a long silence, filled only with the sound of her ragged breathing. "It was all you," she whispered. "All this time. It was you." "I just wanted you to be happy, Lily," he said softly. "That's all I ever wanted." "Happy?" she said, a note of bitter irony in her voice. "I wasn't happy. I was comfortable. I was living a lie. You gave me everything and I gave you nothing. I treated you like you didn't matter." "You always mattered to me," he said simply. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice pleading. "Why did you let them do it? Why did you let me believe it?" He closed his eyes, the weight of that question settling on him. "Because I was a coward," he said, the admission costing him more than all the money he had ever given away. "I was afraid. I was afraid that if you knew the truth, if you had to choose between my world and theirs, you would choose them. And I couldn't bear the thought of losing you completely. So I chose to have a small piece of you, rather than risk having none at all." It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her, and the truth of it was a painful, liberating release. "You didn't lose me," she sobbed. "I lost you. They took you from me and I let them." They talked for over an hour, the conversation disjointed, painful, but utterly, brutally honest. She told him about the years of subtle manipulation, the casual dismissals of his efforts, the way she had been taught to see his love as inadequate. He told her about the lonely nights, the quiet sacrifices, the pain of watching another man take credit for his love. They were not just a father and daughter talking. They were 2 strangers, bound by blood but separated by a wall of deceit, trying to find their way back to each other through the rubble. "What do we do now?" she asked finally, her voice exhausted. "I don't know," he admitted. "We take it one day at a time. We learn to tell the truth." Can I see you?" she asked, her voice small and hesitant. "Tomorrow?" "Of course, my dear," he said, a small, fragile hope beginning to bloom in his chest. Of course you can. When he hung up the phone, the apartment was still quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet now. It was not the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of a long, painful storm that had finally passed, leaving behind a clean, quiet, and hopeful dawn. He had not just gotten a phone call, he had gotten a second chance. The wedding reception did not recover. The revelation had been a bomb, and the fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The carefully curated atmosphere of joy and celebration had evaporated, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable cloud of scandal and speculation. The guests, after a period of awkward, whispered conversations, began to make their excuses and leave in droves. Lily and Tom did not return to the ballroom. They left the hotel through a side exit, their wedding finery feeling like a costume from a play that had ended in disaster. They didn't go to the luxurious honeymoon suite that had been booked for them. They went to Tom's small, simple apartment, a place that suddenly felt more real and honest than the gilded cage they had just escaped. The honeymoon was canceled. The gifts were left unopened. The first few days of their marriage were not spent on a sun-drenched beach, but in a series of quiet, difficult conversations. Tom, who had been as deceived as Lily, was a pillar of quiet strength. He listened, he held her when she cried, and he did not judge. He had married a woman he thought was a wealthy heiress, and he had discovered she was the daughter of a quiet, self-sacrificing hero. He found he was not disappointed. Lily's relationship with her mother and stepfather, however, was shattered beyond repair. The day after the wedding, Elena and David had shown up at Tom's apartment, their faces a mixture of anger and desperate pleading. "You have to understand, Lily," Elena had begun. "We did it for you." But the words, which had once held so much power, were now meaningless. Lily looked at them, at the two people who had been the architects of her life, and she saw only strangers. "No," she had said, her voice calm and steady. "You did it for yourselves. You did it for the house, for the cars, for the country club membership. You did it for the illusion. And you used my father's love and my own ignorance to pay for it. There's nothing left to say." She had closed the door on them, both literally and figuratively. The break was clean, absolute, and final. The new reality was harsh. Lily, who had never had to think about money, was suddenly confronted with the practical, unglamorous details of everyday life. She and Tom began to build a life together based not on a foundation of lies, but on their own modest means. Tom was a high school history teacher, and his salary was respectable, but not extravagant. They learned to budget, to cook at home, to find joy in simple things: a walk in the park, a movie on the couch, a shared bottle of cheap wine. But the most significant part of Lily's new reality was the slow, tentative process of getting to know her father again. The day after the wedding, she had gone to his apartment. It was a small, unassuming place, but it was filled with a warmth and authenticity that her mother's sprawling, perfectly decorated house had always lacked. The walls were covered in books and framed photographs of her as a child. Real photographs, not the staged professional portraits that adorned David's mansion. They sat for hours, drinking tea, talking. It was awkward at first. They were like two people on a first date, carefully navigating the unfamiliar territory of a relationship that should have been the most natural thing in the world. She asked him about his work, about his life, about the things he loved. She learned that he was a talented, respected graphic designer who had a passion for restoring old books. She learned that he loved jazz music and old black and white movies. She learned that he had a quiet, dry sense of humor that she had never been allowed to see. She saw, for the first time, not the failed father of her mother's narrative, but a man of immense strength, integrity, and quiet dignity. A man who had willingly made himself small so that she could have a bigger life. The weight of his sacrifice and her own unwitting complicity in his erasure was a heavy burden, but it was a burden she was determined to carry. She began to visit him regularly. They would cook together, his simple, hearty meals a welcome change from the fancy, tasteless food of her former life. They would go for walks, talking for hours. She was not just rebuilding a relationship. She was excavating a history that had been buried alive. She saw the pain in his eyes when he spoke of her mother, but she also saw a deep, abiding love that had survived even the most profound betrayal. She began to understand that his sacrifice had not been a sign of weakness, but of a love so powerful it had been willing to make itself invisible. Tom, too, began to build a relationship with his new father-in-law. He found in Mark a quiet wisdom and a genuine warmth that he had never felt from the charismatic but emotionally hollow David. They would talk for hours about history, about books, about life. Tom, who had been initially impressed by David's wealth and status, now found himself in awe of Mark's quiet, unshakable integrity. The new reality was not easy. It was filled with moments of regret, of sadness, of a profound sense of loss for the years that had been stolen. But it was also filled with a new, fragile hope. Lily was finally getting to know her true father. And in doing so, she was finally, for the first time in her life, getting to know herself. Months passed, and the seasons turned. The raw, gaping wound of the wedding day began to heal, leaving behind a scar that would always be a part of their story, but one that no longer ached with every breath. Lily and Tom settled into their new life, a life that was smaller in scale but infinitely richer in meaning. They found a small apartment of their own, furnished it with second-hand treasures, and filled it with the kind of easy, genuine laughter that had been absent from Lily's previous gilded existence. The third Sunday in June arrived, a bright, warm, and unassuming day. Father's Day. In previous years, this day had been a source of quiet, unspoken tension for Lily. It had meant a lavish, obligatory brunch with David, complete with expensive gifts and performative declarations of gratitude. It had also meant a brief, awkward phone call to Mark, a perfunctory Happy Father's Day that always felt hollow and inadequate. This year, there was no brunch with David. There was no phone call. There was only a plan. Lily and Tom drove to Mark's apartment in the late morning. They didn't bring expensive gifts. Tom carried a simple, homemade apple pie, its cinnamon scent filling the car. Lily held a single, carefully wrapped package. Mark opened the door, and his face lit up with a genuine, unreserved smile. It was a smile Lily was finally getting used to, a smile that reached his eyes and crinkled the skin at their corners. "Happy Father's Day, Dad," she said, and this year the words felt right. They felt true. They spent the afternoon in a comfortable, easy rhythm. They ate the pie in his small, sunny kitchen. They talked about books, about Tom's students, about the new rosebush Mark had planted on his small balcony. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic pronouncements. There was just the quiet, steady hum of a family rediscovering itself. Finally, Lily handed him the small wrapped package. "It's not much," she said, her voice a little hesitant. Mark unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a simple, elegant silver frame. It held 2 photographs. The first was the one from his mantelpiece, the picture of a 5-year-old Lily perched on his shoulders at the county fair, her face a mask of pure, sticky joy. The second was a new photograph, one Tom had taken just a week before. It was of her and Mark sitting on a park bench, laughing. She was leaning against him, her head on his shoulder, her expression one of utter, complete contentment. He stared at the 2 images, at the ghost of the past and the promise of the present, and his eyes filled with tears. "There," Lily said softly, her own eyes shining. "That's my dad, my real dad." He looked up at her, at the beautiful, strong, and honest woman she was becoming, and he felt a wave of love so powerful it almost took his breath away. He had lost a fortune. He had endured years of quiet, invisible pain. He had been erased, dismissed, and betrayed. But in the end, he had not lost. He had won. He had not won back the money he had spent. He had not won an apology from those who had wronged him. He had won something far more precious. He had won back his daughter's heart. He had won back his own dignity. He had won the right to be seen, to be known, to be loved for who he truly was. He reached across the table and took her hand, his grip firm and steady. "Thank you, my dear," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that needed no explanation. "This is the best gift I have ever received." They sat there for a long time, a father and a daughter, in a small, quiet apartment, the afternoon sun streaming through the window. The world outside, with its noise and its lies and its false, glittering prizes, faded away. All that mattered was this quiet, simple, and profound moment of truth. The true inheritance had finally been claimed.